threshold of 12 people. We are one away. So I've set 12 as the magic number because at that point there's 10 people besides me and Alessandro in attendance and like double-digit impact.
Sounds great.
So I won't let it, we're already about 8 minutes in, and I promised Alessandro that at exactly 5:30, however far I got in my demos, I would hand things over to him. So I'm kicking this puppy off. Okay. Actually, we're still having a couple of things. Who did just join? We're 13. We're launching this puppy. Okay, welcome to the New England Sitecore User Group Diaspora Edition, number 4 or 5. Let's see. Let's move to the next slide. We're talking about Sitecore and Docker, and Dan's fiddling with his PowerPoint. Okay. So, Alessandro, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a principal developer of Velir, and I work with Sitecore for 7 years now. So it's 2 less than since I moved in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I'm still pretty new. I consider myself still pretty new with the Sitecore community. I really start to do a lot and started more involved last year with, and you may associate my name with the waveform formatter conversion tools. And this year I've been I'm very happy to become a Sitecore technology MVP.
Thanks, Alessandro.
Dan, pass to you.
Yeah. My name is Dan Solovay. I work with Alessandro, Sitecore practice lead at Velir. I've been MVP for a long time. Alessandro is at the phase of the MVP lifecycle where he's doing these amazing things like building web forms for marketers, conversion tools. And I'm at the kind of phase of MVP of like, oh crap, I better do a user group. Yeah, and I'll follow in that vein as we go on to how we're dividing up the material. But you know, I blog from time to time, and I mostly now on the Velir blog, and anything I publish I put on Dan Solovay. And yeah, that's basically. I'm sure there's a better bio I could have given, but that's the one you're getting. Overview. So I'm in the phase of like, I'm new and excited about Docker, and I'm finally getting things to work, and things are starting to make sense to me. So I'm going to convey some of that new kid enthusiasm of you know, how to do the basic stuff in Docker, what some of the concepts are, what are things you can confuse, and start to lead that up to, you know, how you can start working with Sitecore. But a lot of the stuff I'll be showing you doesn't involve Sitecore, some of it does, but really just trying to hammer into basic concepts. And then Alessandro, you want to talk about your piece of it?
Yeah, so I'll talk about the Sitecore Docker Images project and the community involvement with it, and also my personal involvement with the project itself. And then I'll explain and drive through 3 different scenarios beyond the basics concept of Sitecore, of Docker, applied to Sitecore and how to work with them. And then I'll conclude with just some thoughts about why Sitecore and Docker, why it matters, why it is a significant change in how we work with Sitecore.
And Alessandro's portion begins in exactly 18 minutes. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Docker journey. And yet I had...
Dan, can you record it? We forgot to record it.
I think it is. I see a big red dot here.
Oh, it is. Then sorry for interruption. Yeah. No, I was seeing the button under, and it's now red because you are recording. So sorry for that.
I've got that covered.
Okay, yeah. Awesome.
All my moments of meta are recorded for posterity. So Docker journey, I'm going to talk a little bit about. Let's talk a little bit about like what this thing is, what the different steps of it are. So you build images and containers, and I'll talk about the difference of them, using a tool called Docker Desktop, or there's a command line. And these are kind of like frozen versions of servers. Like, you know, let's say you're going to cook dinner, but you're not very talented at cooking. You go down to the freezer and you get a frozen dinner out of the freezer and you put it in the microwave. And then you have dinner, and that's Docker. It's like and then let's say, burn the dinner, and you did something horrible to the dinner. You can go down to the freezer and get another one. So that's like the real power of this thing. Alessandro pointed out to me when I came up with that metaphor that that's not Italian cooking. Anyway, you can always get back to a starting point. And so that's kind of a lot of the appeal of it. So we'll be talking about how you create these starting points and how you work with them. And then once you create a starting point, an image that you can use, you can share it with other people. And so, you can, it could be your own application that you're sharing, or it could be, let's say you want to work with Solar or Mongo or SQL Server, you can just pull it down and just work with it. So I'm going to talk about that kind of infrastructure and what that looks like. And with an actual application like Sitecore, you've got a lot of different pieces. You've got the CM, the CD, the Solar, SQL Server. If you get up to Commerce, it gets up to 13 different elements. Getting all of those started as separate containers would be a very, very complicated process, but there's actually a tool called Docker Compose that makes it a one-click option. And I'll show you a little bit what that looks like with a simple example of it. And that's more for your own developer experience. But when you are actually deploying it to production, you'll use a tool. There are more sophisticated tools for orchestrating containers. In production, Kubernetes is, I think, the standard one right now. There was one called Docker Swarm, and my understanding is that's becoming less used. Alessandro and I have not gotten that far yet. And we're still really in the developer experience. So if anyone is working with Kubernetes or is running Docker in production and wants to do a follow-up user group presentation, that would be awesome. But we will not be covering that in this one. But just wanted to say that's kind of the final place where this ends up, is you start running these, you start using these to actually build your websites and run your website. So I want to talk a little bit about images and containers because it can get a little confusing what the difference is between the two. An image is kind of like that frozen dinner that you can get from the microwave. It is, if you get 10 different copies of Hungry Man spaghetti and meatballs, they're all going to be pretty much the same. And so that's that idea. They're all, it's something that is, if I get the Mongo 7 image, or the Mongo 3 image, it's going to be the same thing. They're built from scripts, and they're built in layers. So the script, I'll get into some examples that the scripts are called Docker files. And those are helpful because they kind of give you a standard way of creating something. So for instance, there's the Sitecore containers that are starting to be built by the community that Alessandro is going to go into a bit more. You could build them on top of one version of Windows or another version of Windows. And the fact that it's a scripted process to build them makes that a very repeatable process. It's kind of like continuous integration kind of built into it. They're built in layers, and that's a really key thing. I don't know if you've worked with VMs. There's this kind of, every time you have kind of snapshotting in VMs where you can go back to a previous point in time. And the way that the VM manages that is that it's changing. It's kind of keeping track of every bit that changed. And it says, here's what things look like here. And then you change the following bits. And so I need to know if I keep track of these changes, I can apply them on top of the earlier copy, and I can get where you're at. And so that idea then gets, that idea is an old one, but in Docker, it uses that to make things extremely efficient. That fact that the VMs are built of layers doesn't really help you because they're huge. But in Docker, basically anything that is in a lower layer is only kept once. So for instance, if you've got a container that is running an application and you've made a bunch of changes, if you shut the container off, The only thing that's being kept on disk is your changes. And it just knows, oh, I need to take your changes and put them on top of this image that I also have somewhere else. And that image is just the changes on top of another image. So it makes the use of disk very efficient. And then they're shareable. I mean, you can push an image up to Docker Hub the same way you would push source code up to GitHub. And that metaphor is intentional, and the commands are very similar: push, pull, tag. So containers is when you take an image and you run it, you get a container. It has its own local file system, so it basically takes all those layers and then makes it into a kind of a mini PC. It's strictly isolated from all other processes, so that is what makes this a viable approach. It is writable. It's got a special layer where things can be written, and then it's intentionally disposable. Like once you're done with it, you know, your workflow should be designed in such a way that you can always discard a container and create a new one, going back from your immutable image sources. And I'm just going to quickly show you, I have a note to myself to show you some of these tools here. So this is Docker desktop, and we see a bunch of containers I have that are not running. And we see a few that I have that are running. So I've got a Mongo one running. And if you don't name them, they come up with these kind of cute little names to take an adjective and a computer scientist. So you have things like angry Torvalds or pensive Turing and so forth. They're cute, but you usually will name them and make them a little easier to manage. I now talk a little bit about the commands that are used for images versus containers, because that can get very confusing. You build an image, and then you use that image to create a container. You can tag an image, and then you can push it up to, let's say, Docker Hub or Azure, or you can pull it down. And then if you want to delete it, there's a remove image command. With containers, you can create them, rename them, start them, stop them. Run is kind of create and start in one command. Execute allows you to hit an existing container, and then it has its own remove. So let me just show you. So, and that's not to memorize those, but just to be aware of the distinction. So if you do Docker help, you can see your basic commands you have to work with, and then just, you know, be mindful of, you know, these build an image, create a new container. So just be aware of that distinction. And the help is pretty extensive, so that you can go Docker create help. Extensive but not responsive, but that'll give you, you can drill into any command and kind of get documentation how to run any of them. So let's start playing with some containers. So the simplest one, you can see the screen okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so just to get you started, you can do Docker run hello world. And if I didn't have this loaded, this would go out to Docker Hub, pulls down the hello world container. The hello world container has a text file, and it basically, it has the one command of running this of outputting this text. I mentioned that you can get at a running container. So one thing we could do, if we wanted to actually take a look at this thing, world. actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip down, but I am going to show you building a container. And again, it's going to be a very, very simple example of a Docker file. So I basically said, okay, and I wanted to change this message to make it kind of more user group friendly, but I ran into a Windows permission issue I did not have time to resolve. But I wrote a small little Docker file. So Docker file is, and I'll jump to, yeah, we're on that slide. So a Docker file is what you use, is that recipe I told you about, you use to build them. So if we go, you can see I have a very short, this is a very simple Docker file, but it's got some important things. It's the from statement is the starting point. So the way Docker, the way things are always built in images, excuse me, built in layers, this is what tells you what your starting point is. You have the ability to pass in parameters. And then I'm just going to copy a message over to another text file. So let's run that. So we're going to use Docker build. And I'm going to pass it in arg. And we're going to give it a name, which we're going to use tag to do that. And we'll tell it my new container. Actually, it's an image. Give it the proper name, my new image. Okay. And we got to tell it where to find a Docker file, so we can add a doc. And you can see, just the thing I want to call out here is that each step in this process is creating its own image. So like if you have 5 different commands, it's creating 5 different layers. And one of the things that the Docker training, that if you do like the getting started with Docker, they have actually some nice exercises on that where they kind of guide you in thinking about what order to put these in. So that if you're doing something, if you have, let's say, 5 different containers that are mostly the same but differ in one way, if you put the thing that differs towards the end of your script, then that will allow it to just reuse, the images that you've created before. That makes the whole process more efficient. So we could run that. And it'll give you the same output. But if we, and I'm going to add a couple parameters to allow us to have an interactive terminal. And while I'm waiting this to open, this is just going to show you the, we can look inside and see the original container, the stuff that came from the layer on top of it, and we can see the stuff that we've added. And we see type, and that's that. Okay. And now we're going to get out of this. And let's tag our image. So we want to push it up to Docker Hub. So we have to give it a name. If I just tried to push this, if I just went and said, okay, I want to push Docker push my new image. It's going to yell at me because it's basically what I'm saying with this command is, I want my new image to be just like Redis or Mongo or Solar. I want it in the core namespace of Docker. And it's going to say, you don't have permissions to do that. So it prepared, and this is, it then says, I don't have allowed access, so I'm going to rename it with Docker tag Solovay, my new image. And I have to say the old image first. I think I have about 30 seconds to run through about 8 more demos, Alessandro. I don't think that's going to happen. Wrapping up, but I think this is a useful thing to say. Docker push Solovay, my new image. And that foreign layer is, it's not actually pushing Windows up to Docker Hub. So if we were to go up to Docker Hub, you can see it was just created right there a couple seconds ago. Now, one of the cool things you can do, this is an actual website, and I'm going to skip that demo because I don't have time for it, but you can actually create an image in Visual Studio with Visual Studio 2019. You have the ability to say, one of the checkboxes when you do File New Project is to build something in Docker. And you can then just, as one of your deployment options, you can push to Docker Hub. And then once it's in Docker Hub, you can run a command line tool, a command line option, or with the Azure command line, or you can do it in Azure, where you can just get to, you can basically push the container up to the website. So that takes about 10 minutes to run, but I do want to just show you. So this is something I built in Visual Studio, File New Project, added a little bit of text to the H1, use Visual Studio to push up the Docker Hub, use the Azure command line to create a website, and that was like a one-liner, and then now it's up in Azure. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a feeling of the deployment process. And I'm just going to end with one more thing. We had a slide on opening up containers. And I'd say, in all honesty, the demos for this would run for another 15 minutes. So I'm not going to go through them, but I am going to talk a little bit about this before handing this off to Alessandro. Out of the box, a container is pretty cut off. You can, as part of your Docker file, you can say that a port should be open, so that, for instance, the Mongo container opens up port, the standard Mongo port 27017, and so the Solo container opens up port 8983. So it's kind of like opening up with a firewall. When you create a container, you can map the port the container has open to a port on your host machine. So let's say your container is a website. It might have port 80. You might map that to port 8888. And then you could go localhost 8888 and be able to get to your website. So the Sitecore one, for instance, has localhost 44001. And I'll show you in a moment where that's scripted. And the main point I was going to get to in my 15 minutes of demos that will not happen is that it's a lot harder to do this on the command line. It's somewhat finicky syntax to create a port. It is very finicky syntax to create a network. So you could have one container running, talking to another container. You can't get at either of them, but they can talk to each other. And finally, volumes and bind mounts are ways that, normally containers have their own file system and we just went into one and looked at it, you can actually say part of that file system lives elsewhere. And the reason for doing that is that if you, although a container can store information, if you ever have to replace or rebuild it, or you need to get it to someone else's machine, that information can't travel with it. So by having a mount, you can say, actually, my source code lives this directory I want on my host machine, I want to appear inside the container. Distinction between bind mounts and volumes. Volumes are managed by Docker. So you don't have to have everything perfect. You just say, by the way, I want you to just keep track of this and keep it outside of the container. And bind mounts, you say, no, I am taking ownership of this. So what Docker recommends, and if you want me to look into that, if we have time during Q&A, I can show you some of those commands. But Docker recommends when you're getting started, use volumes, because Docker will, like, if you create a Solar container and you say, I want everything inside, Solar/server to be managed by outside of the container. If you use a volume, Docker will, when it's actually building the image, put everything in there and say, I meant to say when it's building the container from the image, it'll put everything into that location, that persistent location. If you say, I want to use a bind mount that I specify, you have to get it perfect. So it just, bind mounts are used by the Sitecore solution because you want to be able to push, code changes out to it, or get at logs directly without having to go kind of into Docker's world. But just to be aware of the distinction. And then finally, this is all very finicky syntax. Docker Compose, and I will end with that, allows you to tie this all together into a very terse YAML file that basically describes everything you need to do to get a multi-container solution up and running. Let me just end with showing you the Docker Compose for a Sitecore XM configuration. So we have, pretty elegant YAML syntax. We have all the servers laid out. We have the SQL instance, we have the Solar instance, we have CD, and we have CM. And it actually expresses the dependencies. So it says CD depends on SQL and it depends on Solar. So it uses that to set them up in the right way. Here we see the ports. We see that the CD uses port 44002 on the host machine to map to 80. And we see that the source directory inside of the container maps to data deploy. And that's what you can use to push out file changes. And if you want to see that in action, we can come back to that in Q&A. So, basically the nice thing about this is that on the command line, to get, let's see if I have this still open. Yeah, I'll just do, we're in, yeah. If I do Docker Compose, I can bring all my containers down with just one word. And then now it's taking this four down. If I did Docker Compose up, it would bring them all up in one command. So it just takes all of the complexity. Once you've got things kind of figured out to a fine degree, you can use this to kind of tie everything together. And then the one last thing, again, we can't cover everything in Q&A, that's cheating, but if someone does want to see it, Visual Studio 2019 greatly simplifies debugging. So the same way you're used to attaching to a process in let's say if you're attaching to a W3 process, you now have an option to say, actually, I want to attach to a container. And then you have to select whether you want Windows containers or Linux containers. You select Windows, and it says, oh, you've got these 7 containers running. And then you pick the one you want, you pick the W3 process, and it's really almost the same as if developing in your own, in your own workstation. So I am going to hand presenter over to Alessandro at this point.
Okay, then if you
I'm realizing, hold on a second. And can I still record when I'm not sharing? I think
yes,
so.
Yeah, because you still do the meeting going, and I'll just share.
Yeah, and I'm realizing, like a complete PowerPoint noob, I think I was confused between the presenter mode, and I might have been a slide off, but I think I just put on the Docker Compose slide. That was supposed to be up a minute ago. Okay, so let me stop sharing. Actually, stop share.
Okay.
And do I need to do it? Do you have access to share, Alessandro?
I do. And let me see if. Can you see my screen?
Yep, I see it.
Okay, awesome. Perfect. So next topic to present today in our agenda is about the Sitecore Docker Images project. This is it's been officialized by Sitecore, but is a community-driven effort. It started in 2018, when is the repo, the beginning of 2018 when the repo was created and made public. And only last year, the repo was moved under the Sitecore company umbrella ownership organization in GitHub. The repository contains PowerShell scripts that facilitate and helps us to facilitate the build of images, and Docker files that, as Dan explained before, contains the steps to build images. The repository contains starts to have more complex topology, like XP topologies, is starting to be available starting with Sitecore 9.2. But there are also Docker files for Sitecore version older than 9.2. It actually starts, the legacy images start from 7.5. The big difference is that the new build script, the new build process is now very compatible with the legacy images. So if you are interested in building an older image, the ingredients for the recipe are in the repository, but you may need to tweak or modify the build script in order to make it work as you want. One big change between the legacy images and the new images is that the license is not embedded anymore in new images, and that's very important because removes dependencies of when a license expires. So if you want to share an image through different environments, there is no need now to embed that license anymore in the image. Another big improvement in the build script has been also the removal of the dependencies with CIF when installing Sitecore on the base Windows images, and instead the steps are much simpler, much easier to read and go through, and they are based on using web deploy packages for all the assets that you need to set up to install Sitecore. So it's very important to have, when you build your images, to have internet access, because the first thing that the build script does is to pull all the assets for all the images and variances needed for managing the repository. And if you want to extend and build and extend an existing image to install another module, another package, is definitely recommended to use as an asset for that process a web deploy package, WDP file. If it doesn't exist for a module, there are scripts shared in the stock exchange or blog posts about how to convert a normal Sitecore package to a WDP file. The build script supports different as a main build PowerShell script that supports the build of different topology, different variants, and also supports the ability to push the built images in a remote registry. So maybe I'll show you just what is possible with the images and with the build script. Well, actually before that, let me show you my images because I'll show how the Docker registry, the Sitecore Docker images project also defines a structure naming convention for the build images. And so in what I'm showing here, I'll just grab one of these. Let me expand. Okay, perfect. So as you can see, there are two, the first two columns represent, the first block is the composition of a registry and a repository. A repository is the group of images that share the same service functionality, but they may have differences between them, and those differences are tracked with tags. So in this case, my tag for the Sitecore XP standalone image tells me that it's composed by two main information. There is the Sitecore version, so in this case it's 9.3.0, and then the operating system. One thing to keep in mind that's very important is that for Windows images, until now, until the last version, before the last version of Windows was released for Windows 10, the version of the host machine, the operating system on the host machine matter. And so if you were building before an image for Sitecore on Windows 10 1909, you couldn't use that image in an older version of Windows 10. Now, with the latest version of Windows 10 2004, that dependency has been removed and there is back compatibility. That's I think it's a big improvement. And another big improvement that has been released in Windows 10 2004 is that the size of the images. You can see that these images are now, they're not very small. Images built on top of Windows base images, they occupy a pretty large amount of data. Well, the new version of Windows cuts this size almost by 50%. So it's definitely, if you are starting this journey for the beginning and you have the opportunity to upgrade to the last version of Windows 10, I definitely recommend that. And one other thing that I want to show is all the options that you have in the build script, and maybe we can run through the parameters that are available. Actually, let me clean this first. And so you will, some of the parameters will ask that your Sitecore username and your Sitecore password. And these are needed to download the assets from the Sitecore download portal. If you have a registry, that is not required, but if you have a registry, you can specify it and also provide registry username and password as well. And then here also you can specify the Sitecore version, and you can specify, and these are all optional parameters. If you don't specify them, it will default to the last version of Sitecore, for example. You can specify the topology, XP, XM, XC for commerce. And you can also specify to include specific variants for that particular topology. And the variants include JSS, SXA, for example, or if you want to have an image with the Sitecore PowerShell. And in the last one that I created for the community, that was my effort this year. Like I made a pull request in May, was to add to the last version of Sitecore 9.3. I added to the XP topology the variant to support Sitecore Horizon. I know that there is no much of development yet for Sitecore Horizon. It's still in a initial version in Sitecore 9.3. But I thought it was good to have a variant for it for demo purposes or to be supported in the future. And so just to show you, yeah, the include, it would be include JSS or include SXA to include other variants. I will now run the build around because it will take, the build itself, if you do for the first time, it takes, I would say probably about between 6 and 10 minutes per image. And so it definitely, once you start to build more images, it will, the build process and how Docker build works, it will use cache version of it. So it will be much faster. One thing also to keep in mind, definitely, well, the Sitecore, the repository also offer Docker Compose files for running configuration. These are starting points. And one of the important things to keep in mind that if you have a registry, keep it private, don't make it public because you don't want to share your Sitecore images publicly out in the world. Okay. So now that we saw all the basics about Docker, we talk about the Sitecore Docker repository in GitHub and the ability to build images. Now you'll have already with these elements the ability to spin up a Sitecore topology on your computer, and you'll be able to start even development. One thing that I noticed when I start to go through this process that there are some needs and specific needs when you work on a project that repository, that project is not explicitly describing. One of them is how can I reach, so we'll see through the next 3 slides, talking about reaching containers, working with HTTPS, and then one specific case, more really for production system, when you're managing something in production, you need to replicate an issue. The need of starting or refreshing a database, restoring a database in a SQL container using backups. So reaching containers, this is when a container runs, the IP address associated with that container is not static, so it will change. And an easier way to work with them is to use an alias, a name, and in order for the Windows host machine to identify, to be able to ping that container using a name instead of an IP address, you have to define in your host file, in your host machine, that internal DNS rule, so the mapping between an IP address and a container name or alias. And it's a manual process. It takes a few steps. And again, every time you stop and restart, you may get a different IP address, you may forget. It's kind of a annoying process in development. And there are 2 automated solutions there that will simplify all this process and you will completely forget about it. The first one is, it's distributed on NPM. It's called Wales names, and it will monitor your running containers and automatically update your host file for you. One thing to keep in mind about Wales names is that you still need to remember to run it, to start it. And if you don't start this application before you start your development, that doesn't get picked up and nothing happens. Another solution that has been developed by a Sitecore MVP, Rob Anneman, is called Windows Host Writer. Runs as a container service and distributed publicly on Docker Hub. And I really enjoy using it because runs with all the other container your services, you can just add the definition in your Docker Compose, and has the ability to update your host file automatically, but also presents another benefit, that is the ability to define not just not just the name of the container, like Will's names will do, but also aliases. So if you define aliases, all those aliases will be mapped in your host file. And this is very useful for a multi-site instance of Sitecore, where you may have the need of pointing more than one domain to a container, to a CM or a CD container. And so this is very useful because automatically will do that mapping for you. And so let me show you quickly the first one of my first demo. I'll show you how to, so I have already some containers running. Let me list them. I type, sorry, container. Here we go. So these are my running containers. And if I want to get the IP address of a container, I'm just showing you the manual process. So I need to do docker inspect and pass like the ID of the container. And then this will give me the list of all the information about that container. So not just the IP address, but under networks, in my network, my net external network, I'll see that the IP address is defined here. And so I'll need to copy this. And this is very a manual process, right? It's not easy to do for all the containers. You can have a nice command. Docker inspect allows you to format the output of the container that you're inspecting. Actually, you also can pass all the running containers. And so this command, docker inspect, and then you can specify the format where you say, I want the IP address and then the aliases that are defined in that container for all the running container. It will, and I need to paste it better. Sorry about that. It will provide that list that you can then copy and paste in the host file. Now, all of this is done by automatically by the Windows host writer mod. So you can see that I didn't have to do this in my host file. Those running container, they automatically get configured in the host file. One thing that I want to show you is my Docker Compose file, where how to set up the monitor. You can see I have my monitor service defined for the Windows host writer. You need to set the amount where your host file lives and the source and target of the Docker engine, since it uses Docker engine to monitor the running containers. And then in each service, you can define the aliases that you want to map to a container, and then also the host header. The host header will give you also the ability to define any header that needs to, or any host header that needs to point to a specific container. And this could be a semicolon delimited list of host header. And I have one, for example, where in my CD service, I had just the name of the container CD, but I also had one for NASG for you can see the format with the semicolon defined. And then if I go in a browser now, I can browse my Sitecore instance with CD or with NASG. Here we go. It was kind of slipping, but it came up. Cool. So back to the slides. So another important thing that with real Sitecore project is that you'll have the need of using the HTTPS protocol when developing, and this is now even more enforced with modern browsers like Chrome that will now allow you to load websites that don't have that are not using an HTTPS protocol in their transfer. So in this case, I found two. There, I don't know, in the community I share two different approaches to work with HTTPS. I want to mention Traffic first because Traffic is an open source. It's an open source tool that is distributed as it's an open source project. There's also an enterprise version that is distributed at a company called Container. And essentially, Traffic is a reverse proxy container service that will, when used, will allow to route and map external traffic to internal traffic in your service. And as the capability of, as the concept of offering what they call middlewares, there are engines that are able to manipulate the request in different ways. You can manipulate the request. Then there are more than 20 different middlewares available in this tool. One that matters for the HTTPS traffic redirection to an internal HTTP is called redirect scheme middleware, and this will do that mapping. One thing, how Traffic works is that it runs as a container service, and then also it will automatically discover in all the running containers the definition and the rules that you want to use in your internal network. Those rules are defined using labels in each container. I personally haven't used it for development because the tool itself requires to dedicate port 80, port 443, and port 8080 to when this tool runs. And if you are like me, still at the beginning of your journey and using, I'm still having a good number of on-premises Sitecore instances, you may find tricky to stop IIS to switch to Docker solution with Traffic and then going back. So instead of using Traffic, at the beginning of this year, Michael West, if you don't know, Michael West is a Sitecore MVP, one of the developers of the Sitecore PowerShell extension tool. Michael West shared to the Sitecore Docker community a custom solution to generate an SSL certificate to an host machine. So it generates in the host machine. You will install it in your certificate in your computer, and then you can install the certificate in the running containers at start time. So the certificate is not part of the image, but it gets installed in the container using an entry point, custom entry point. And the entry point in a container, in a service definition, allow you to override the running command of a container. So you can override the command behavior, the executable behavior that has a container to say, okay, I don't want to use that script, but pass my custom one. And you can also default back to the one that is defined in the container. So for that approach, I'll show you how quickly I have if I try with this address to browse to NASIG, you can see that this is not recognized as a valid certificate. So let's go and create a certificate. So you need to pull the solution from its repository. It's publicly available. And I have it in Docker GPS. And then if you go in the startup folder, the repository, this solution contains all the script that you need to execute and create a certificate. And so I'll create my certificate. And this is the command. You pass the certificate name and then the list of DNS, the domains that you want to include in the certificate. And we will generate and install. And then once you have it, you can just, it will see the output. It generates my certificate. I'll copy them and I'll use in my running solution to, and so that can be available using a mount file, using a volume file, a volume to for the startup process. So I'll copy my source. I've replaced the one that I already have here. Perfect. And then if we go in, you can see that I'm using my customs. I have a startup volume in my, as a volume in my service, my CD service, and then I'm passing my custom entry point that's called startup PS1. And this script will take care of installing a runtime the certificate. So in order to do so, I'll need to stop my, oh, sorry, no, not this. I'll need to stop my, my running service and start again. So I'll do that. And I'm using for this demo right now, you can see I had all these containers running. It was part of the Horizon variants that I built that is available. It's still not part of the, has not been merged yet, the pull request I opened in May, but it's pull request 308, and it has all these, both concepts, as the concept that we saw before of the monitor that RAB and MM modules offers, and then also the solution Michael West does with working with HPS. So if you're looking for a public example of how to start with both two approaches, it's publicly available on the Sitecore Docker repository. So I'm stopping them gracefully, and so it's probably stopping before it's taking a little bit of time. And once all the connections are closed, it will stop them as well. And then I'll start again. While we wait for my Docker to react, so we'll go back to that demo. So once it's waiting, I don't want to pause. Oh, it's done. Well, then never mind. I need to be more patient. So let me start it again. We replace the certificate. And with the command down, didn't just stop but remove. And the big difference there is that when you remove a container, all your data in that container that is stored inside the container goes away. So when you start again, you start from a fresh state of that, a fresh image, a fresh writable image of that container, for that container. So the delay in starting different services is done using defining the ALF probes between different containers in your Docker Compose file. And you can define if the dependencies between container needs to be done if the container starts or if the container is healthy. I mean, that means that there is an ALF probe that needs to return a specific status. Now, something also important to keep in mind is that, and this is up, something to keep in mind with Docker Compose that is very useful to know is that Docker Compose has the ability to respond to exit codes from running containers. So if a running container, let's say your test fails and returns a status code of different than 0, you can then use that information when you run integration tests to stop and for example, remove all your services and act based on that status. So something useful to know. Okay, so let me refresh now that I swapped the certificate, and that's just Firefox. Let me open this in Chrome. It's Firefox enforcing. And I expect to see a valid certificate now when this comes up. Okay, well, while that comes up, let me switch to, and then we'll verify that. So the third case, the third scenario that I want to talk and is about ability to restore database backups. And this is very simple approach. Like was when I was starting to understand the power of entry points. Is that sometimes I work in production support Velir, and many times I have the need of having a perfect copy of production content in my non-production environment. To troubleshoot or to reproduce an issue, a specific issue. So this is the need where I need to restore database backup. For development, many times you probably have your content that supports your code in using serialization and synchronization tool like TDS or Unicorn. But in this scenario, where you need specific content that is beyond a Sitecore package, it's sometimes easier to just refresh using backup. And the way that the SQL containers work is that if you don't have any database in your data volume, it will seed new vanilla Sitecore databases. So they're always fresh and new. I overrode this behavior with a custom entry point to introduce a new backup volume, and that volume, and now my entry point scripts look for presence of database backups, and if they exist, it will use those backup files instead of the seeded vanilla database backups. So it's pretty simple, but the solution is fully described and the script is available on my blog. So you can find it. This is I wrote an article with the script available in case you need to override with an entry point that behavior. Let me check if my site is up. Yep. So you can see that now my NASA domain is valid and the certificate is valid. Perfect. Cool. So to close this presentation today, I think last slide, I want to talk about why Sitecore on Docker, why your organization, our organization, Velir, is doing this, and you guys should also do if you are not doing it. I think there are benefits in both development and production. And in development, definitely one of the biggest benefit is consistency and easy setup for a developer to set up their own environment for a project. You don't have to install Sitecore anymore. You just spin up you compose a topology that you are interested with Sitecore, and then it's up. If you are developing on different projects at the same time, and you need to have ability to have different version of a software, this is super helpful. Docker helps a lot there because you don't leave a lot of installation behind in your host machine, and you can easily avoid any conflict within them. Like a different version of Sitecore, have different version of Solar, for example, and it could be challenging to maintain and to maintain and have running on your instance on your computer at the same time. All of these instances you can uninstall and reinstall easily. So Docker helps on that. And if you start your development to also run integration tests, one of the tasks, very our task when you run integration tests, is to clean up the environment to once you are done with your test, to start again and repeat those tests again for the next session. If you have Docker, you just need to stop and remove your containers and start fresh new ones, and it's all running. and you can run your tests easily again. In production, we talk about it's much cheaper infrastructure because it shares the kernel from your host machine. I was reading an article, just to give an example. I don't have metrics of cost between an on-prem versus Docker yet. We are not there yet, but I was reading an article for of the Financial Times team moving their infrastructure last year. I was in 2018 from on-prem to Docker, and they mentioned that they save 80% of their infrastructure costs with that move. So that was huge, was very significant save. And then you gain consistency in deployments because you always have the same images that you promote through different environments up to production. And then one other big benefit that I thought about is in a true blue-green deployment approach. This is a very easy with Docker to spin up a new instance in blue-green deployment of your solution where you deploy your code, and then you easily with a load balancer like Traffic, you can just then, or an orchestrator like Kubernetes, you can then swap and transfer the traffic to a new instance. If you have traffic on blue, you go to green, and vice versa. And it's the big benefit here is that you can tear down that very easily, because what you really need behind the scene is it's a VM, right? And you are then your containers running on it in a simplified way. Instead, with a blue-green deployment approach, for example, on Azure PaaS, or let's not even think about on-premises, to spin up all those resources in your infrastructure takes a lot of time, and then also the installation of Sitecore on top of it and all that process. So with Docker, the blue-green deployment approach becomes much faster. So just to conclude is, I feel like Docker is great for development, but and it's fantastic to adopt for development purposes. But if you are also able to adopt for all the full flow, your delivery chain up to production, then even better. And now we have 6:15, so we went over, but we may have some little time for questions.
In my opinion, we had the cocktail hour. We had virtual beer and virtual pizza.
Yes, I wish we had that.
People could virtually leave if they want to, but I think we should stick around for a bit. And I'm itching to do at least one of the demos I didn't get to. So if no one has any questions. So how can we just, let's look at I'll look at the chat to see if anyone.
Yes.
I was going to say, Corey had a comment there.
Yeah, so Corey Caplet, that's one note. Another production benefit is the option to choose which public cloud you want to run on. With Sitecore PaaS, you are tied to Azure. Okay. Yeah, vendor flexibility is always a good thing.
That's a very good thought, yes. The ability of their shareability, you can share an image and you can run a container without worrying about the platform. That's big, because then you can have competitors, not just one single platform, and so the price definitely it's more competitive, it goes down.
I've heard that not from personal experience, but that if you're using Kubernetes, that it might be a little bit different from cloud to cloud, but that there's a little bit, some engineering effort that goes into that. But the base scripts you're relying on, the base configurations are probably all the same.
Cool.
I had a question, Alessandro, about your the HTTPS thing. Does that thing also hit Solar? And is this communication between Solar and like the CM and the CD over HTTPS?
It does. So I don't have that configured, but you can. So the ability, I think the last version that Michael shared in his repo gives the ability to fall back to another entry point that you may have, so that you can build a chain of entry points that get executed. And so in that way, with Solar, you could you could use that just to install a certificate and configure the certificate in the container, and then fall back to the entry point that Solar uses.
Cool. Yeah, there's a raise hand feature on Zoom, but I've never figured it out. So you'll just have to yell at us if you want to.
What kind of development machine should you have to run a 9.3 environment? What would you recommend?
So definitely 32 gigabytes of RAM. That's minimum, I will say, because when you have a full XP1 topology, the one similar to the one that was running now, it will have I don't remember the number, but I think 8, 9 different containers running. If you have commerce, we are talking about close to 15, 16 containers, and so definitely each of them you have to allocate a minimum amount of RAM. And then the CPU, I think the recommendation it's at least 4 cores, but if you're more, the 4 is much better. And this is where people get confused about when you first start to use Docker versus a VM. They try to compare them in terms of resources uses, and they say, wait a minute, my VM is using less than all that your containers are using. Yes, but your VM is not an XP1 topology. It's a single VM, where a standalone system where you're running everything in one single machine. But if you had to split the VM with all their operating systems or kernels across 15 VMs, then definitely you will never be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just have to say, as a personal note, I really love SIM and being able to spin up a fresh Sitecore instance with a click. And that was really helped me when I was trying to troubleshoot an issue and just say, what does this look like on vanilla? And then once Sitecore 9 hit, you basically lost that ability. I mean, you do have the ability if you're running a very simplified, but if it's an XP configuration, or God forbid a commerce configuration with like 13 different things running on, the ability to just get me a new one is gone. And Docker and the Sitecore Docker project really brings it back to the point where I'm now using it all the time. I'll see a question on like our internal Slack about how some detail of Sitecore works, and I want to let me just take a look on a fresh install, and I can just Docker compose up, boom. Let me take a look. So it kind of gets you back to that happy place.
Yeah, one usage that I had that is not tied with development with the Sitecore project, but for me, I use Docker to test the web form formatter conversion tool with different versions of Sitecore. And so I found very easy in that way as well. Like you don't have to have all those instances on premises. You can test your module or your tool against different versions very easily. So it's powerful.
I don't know if this was covered. The kids ran in a couple times during your conversation, but are any of them running Linux hosts, like for the Sitecore hosts? In theory, right? They could run on Linux.
They can. So thank you for reminding me, because I didn't mention that, but I can. One of the efforts that started in the Sitecore Docker images repository in the last few months, like maybe in February, March, I saw a more strong development in building Linux images to run Solar, to run even SQL. Now that with Windows 10 2004 and the support for Linux subsystems, it really opens the ability to run at the same time Linux containers and Windows containers than before was not possible, only in tests in beta. There's still no management, like you can still cannot compose both at the same time, because you have to switch context, like you have to switch modality in the desktop in Docker desktop between Linux and Windows, but allows you to keep them running at the same time. That is big. So in that way you could have all these and some of ideally we can have all the .NET Core services running on Linux. I remember there's still some limitation in terms of dependencies with Windows .NET that are not fully running on Linux, and the community is working on removing them.
I mean, I have to imagine with Sitecore offering their own managed services that it's in their best interest to get some of those pieces running on Linux, because it'll be a lower cost to kind of operate them for them as well. So assuming that this, you know, that they'll want to go Docker at some point, but
yeah, definitely it's cheaper. Linux much cheaper than Windows.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to share, just from a developer experience, as I started working with Docker, one thing that came up that was really helpful for me was I was working on a project and I had to set up Solar, and I realized, hey, I don't need to actually install. You know, we had a 7.1, and I needed it. You know, you have different versions of Solar for each release of Sitecore, and so you're having to come up with like new port numbers and keep them all straight. And I thought, oh, why don't I just add a Docker compose file for Solar for just this project? So, you know, we typically have a tools directory in our projects, and I just created one for that. So, you know, even if you're not, and it was like literally just, you know, once you get in the habit of Docker run Solar:6, and you've got Solar, or 6.6, and you've got 6.6 running. Once you get in the habit of like, that's just a few keystrokes, and now you actually have a machine running, you get spoiled. It really can, it's one that, you know, we're all looking for ways to bring efficiency into our workflow, and this is a big one. And one other,
go ahead.
One other thing I wanted to share, one more thought. I just want to, even if you don't have Docker, for whatever reasons you don't want to install Docker Desktop on your PC, there is Docker has a Docker Playground site. It doesn't run Windows containers, but it can run Linux containers. It can run anything that you've pushed up. And you can do, like, just right now, you know, I spun up a Solar instance on it. You just say, give me, like, you have a 20-minute free workspace, and you can run a command, you know, Docker run Solar, and you map your port, and then about a minute later, it says it's ready, and you click it, and now you have a Solar instance that's running. So it just kind of opens your mind to, like, wow, any kind of piece of software, rather than I want to start working with this technology, rather than you know, going through the normal local install, to start to think about, oh, I could just spin up a Docker container. I don't even have to have Docker installed. I could spin it up on Docker's free website.
That resonates with me, Dan, because I just recently installed a 9 release 1. And that's not at all what the experience is like going through that Solar install. So I was going to mention that, so my experience with Docker is pretty limited, but I know I struggled with the fact that things really don't persist, and it felt pretty, like, I feel like I lost my state a few times without meaning to. Like, you know, I kind of blew away all of my machine state and was left with sort of the base image. And you know, I know there's some patterns to help with that in terms of storage, you know, like mounting storage into different containers. And I've even heard of someone at Velir who's using an override on their Docker command line, so they can't run the commands that blow away. That would actually help you. That would make you lose a state, like Docker. I forget what it was, Docker stop or Docker whatever. You know, where you think it might just turn it off, but it actually will, you know, kind of reset all your state. So, Alessandro, have you dealt with any of that in your experimentation?
So the secret with that is that don't store anything that you don't want to lose in your container, and that has been done by the community. Okay. Using volume for your deployed source folder. So any code that is custom code that you deploy in your Sitecore solution lives in a volume.
It's
you
on the
remove
host.
The container, so you open up a new one. Exactly, it's in your host machine. Same with the data of Solr indexes, databases, MDF and log files. The data in the log files lives in your host machine as well. And anything else that you need. So certificates, for example, I made the example now. I'm keeping the certificates outside in my host machine, and they get installed at runtime, so that they don't get lost. You can do the same for really anything that you need. I would say mounted outside so that it doesn't go away, or put in source control.
So don't put anything that you don't want to lose. You know, the containers are, yeah, they're not for persistence.
They're not
you're losing the value if you use it that way. And it's kind of like, it's a line from the Continuous Integration Delivery book. It's just, you know, if it's really hard, keep doing it. And so I would, until it stops being hard. And I would say just going through the exercise of like, okay, do I have my development workflow to the point where I can rebuild this from a new image, from freshly. Like once you've done that, you get confidence. And like, for instance, you know, I didn't have time for these demos, but I had my debugging demo had all of the code used in a mounted volume that used Sitecore's write. It has a file writer so that you can push changes. And you know, once I saw that, oh, I stopped it. I started from scratch. All of my customizations got ingested. I could hit a breakpoint that worked. You start to feel like, okay, yep, this is. I can always. It's like that good feeling with Git, where you can always get back to mastery. You can always get back to the starting point.
Yeah, and one other thing though, so that in terms of sharing data with your container that is not maybe stored in your file system, or you want to kind of protect. There are two ways of sharing information, data with your system with environment variables. And you can see in the example for 9.3 now, they are managing the Sitecore license. It's an environment variable. The connection strings are environment variables. Now the Docker community recommends to use temporary files to store secrets, not environment variable, because environment variables are exposed. But that's the way of all this mutable or configuration data, like a management of the configuration using these two tools, these two approaches is the way to go.
So I have 3 demos they didn't get to. I'm going to ask them whether they want to see any. You only get to see one, because otherwise keep people here to 9 o'clock. But I had persistence, like some of those persistence options using Mongo, so you can see different ways you could you know, actually put data in a location that persists. Debugging with Visual Studio, or just creating a container with Visual Studio with a new MVC project and pushing it up to Azure and making a website. So any interest in any of those? If not, you all get to go home, but you're already home, so you don't get anything.
I thought the debugging option is the most interesting, because I'm sure that's something that people run into all the time. I'm not sure if I can
It's too late. Someone spoke. Blame Corey. You all gonna see debugging. I'm gonna grab presenter, and then you all get to go upstairs or downstairs.
Okay, go.
Yeah. Okay. So, just a second. Share screen. Screen 1. Okay, so going to this Sitecore site. Move my windows around. So I'm the kind of guy who reuses demos. So this is a demo I did for our Sitecore group with Velir, where I had a little custom test ASPX page because I was showing how configuration variable replacement works. But we're going to use this because I have a custom object here, and we want to be able to set a breakpoint on it. So first of all, We were talking about persistence and file shares. Just a second. Dan, if you keep leaving people late for a demo, then you should have it all queued up, particularly if the other guy was speaking. Okay, I'm skipping that. There we go. Okay, so I have a little bit of code. I want to hit a breakpoint here. So this is a object that I'm doing up in the factory when I hit a page. So I want to hit a breakpoint here, and I should hit the breakpoint whenever I refresh this page. So to do that, I am going to go to debug, attach a process. And now you notice I have this on Docker Windows container. That's an option you get with the latest version of Visual Studio 2019. And I can find my containers. And I see my CM container. Because the demo gods are wrathful, this is going to take a minute, but it should load in a sec. And a little background here. I was asking some questions because there's some old blog posts about how you can put a remote debugger inside the container, and you have to put it in this specific file location, and it has to be the version that matches Visual Studio. And I was asking people about that on Sitecore Slack, and there's like, oh no, you don't have to do that anymore. Just get the latest version of Visual Studio. I was like, oh, okay, this is much easier. So here, attach. And now let's refresh the page. The code is different. What did you do, Dan? Did I blast my demo by adding a space? That would be so me. Let's try that one more time. Oh, I see a red breakpoint there. This is good. Let's refresh that again. Yes, awesome. Okay, so we're now actually hitting code that's executing inside of a container in my Visual Studio on my host. And it was a simple debug, attach a process to get there. And let's just change sample property to time for everyone to get a beer. And I think I have to put that in quotes. And now we go F5. And it's the sample factory class value of sample property is time for everyone to get a beer. Okay, on that note, thank you, Alessandro.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, everyone, for coming up. How many did we get up to? We're down to 10, but we were in double digits.
We were close to 14, I think, 14 or 15.
That's epic. And this will all end up, yes.
10 is double digits, that's all.
No, it's not. No, it's not, Nicole, because we don't get to count
it's
myself.
2 digits.
No, Alessandro and I didn't even change my name here.
Okay.
Practically, Dan. Yes. We have a living number of Zoom accounts. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, we don't count. So when we were 12, we had 10 people that weren't us. Thinking,
Length minus 2.
how long did Dan spend on those demos? And he's showing us like Docker file. Did he thought of like 2 hours before? I really ought to show something with Docker file. Let me pull that together because that's really important to see that basic concept and all the stuff I worked on last night. Like I didn't get to. Anyway, see debug. So it's all good. Life is a journey. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alessandro. And time to get a beer.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Alessandro.